Yes, and that plan was to have nothing emotional before I spoke. So I was going first. So most of you know me as Sandy. I was talking to somebody, Lara, outside, who didn't realize my name was Alexander. And it is, of course. I'm Alexander III. I used to ostentatiously write that on my schoolwork in big block letters. At least I didn't write Alexander the Great. That's what I figured I should. But I could have been a Jimmy because Dad's name was supposed to be James Henry. That was the name that his mother gave him, that his parents decided upon, but that his mother gave him. When his, our family knows the story, and probably most of you do, but his dad, the Yankee Lawson, he spent some time in New York, so that was his nickname, went to the bar on the way to the registrar to celebrate, and he tipped a few with his friends and said, "Hey, begor, it's my last one." He was Irish, by the way, born in Ireland, of Scottish heritage. And I'm naming him after myself. And so he named him Alexander Lawson, no middle name. So I'm not a Jimmy, I'm a Sandy. Okay, I need to read this. So there's an African saying that a boy does not become a man until his father dies. I'm certain I'm not the first son to say these words at a celebration of his father's life, but regardless, today before you, I'm a man. My first clear memories of my father are from quite a young age. I was less than 2 years old. We were living in Laval West in Montreal. Dad and his friend Geordie Morgan were digging a cistern in the backyard. Uncle Geordie was the fellow Dad came over from Scotland with, the other piper hired by Ogilvy's department store. I remember them working shirtless in the with spades behind the house, coming in from a hot summer sun for a drink, and I got to have a drink of water with them. For some reason, I remember the heavy, thick red plastic tumblers with the sparkles throughout it. And it was during that era that my brother David arrived. It was likely Mum's idea, but it's indicative of the type of husband and father Alex was, to trust in Joy's intuition. My parents had another woman carry Davy into the house, and it might have been June Morgan, I don't know. Geordie's wife. I could not articulate it at the time, but it was the first time I recall feeling something out of place. It was to protect me from feeling resentful, but to me it was, hey, that's my mom job. He's far too precious for you to hold, lady. But that was typical of our parents, to be cognizant of decisions our young minds might make at such a young age. Alex had married well. Dad was fond of telling me that when I was born and they took me home to their apartment in Montreal North, Dad was holding me and a neighbor met them on the stoop. She congratulated them, and after gooing and gawing at the newborn, she said to Dad, "Ah, il ressemble son papa." Now, we all know that as I grew, I certainly resembled my mother. Dave and Heather got more of Dad's genes. Sheena and I were the spitting images of Joy. And of course, Peter and Marla were the perfect blend of both. Nevertheless, it was a story Dad often repeated to me, and whenever he was proud of something I did, particularly when we discussed our ideologies or theology, Dad would say those words, "Ah, il ressemble son papa," and it never failed to make me smile. Alex was a father ahead of his time. He was a busy man, but when he was home, Dad fed us, he changed diapers, and more than anything, held us and sang to us. As our family grew, whenever he arrived home, Dad always went straight for the youngest to pick them up and sing to them as he rocked them in his arms. There was rarely a free afternoon in our house that didn't involve Dad roughhousing with us, playing To the Moon, lifting us up on his feet, the ubiquitous umpy ho-ho, where he would stack as many kids as possible on his back, make his way around the living room. Or its lame cousin, the three-legged camel, a challenge where Dad would randomly drop an arm, defying us to stay on his back. And in the days when we had a tree swing, it was a race when Dad yelled, "Train starts when the engineer gets there." It's not surprising that I share many of my beliefs with Alex. Dad believed that we were born good, and that we all began with that divine spark within us. We are born of God's light, and we are good. We are blessed with the human experience on this journey of discovery and fellowship, and it's on this journey that we are sometimes distracted by the smaller human things that are less than divine, and that too is natural. Without guidance, some of us might choose a life of hedonism or one that is so self-absorbed as to be damaging to those around us and to our own eternal spirit. Sometimes we dim that light inside of each of us. Dad spent his life helping us reach inside ourselves to find that original blessing, that we may transcend those all too human roadblocks we often place in our paths. We had some great conversations since I became a parent myself, and later through our relationship editing his book, To Light a Penny Candle, editing and archiving his Havers and Clipes, and working on a follow-up, TBA. One of my first jobs out of high school was working in the hospital ward at Valley View Center, and I was working the night shift in the nursery wing. One of the permanent residents was a young boy of about 7 or 8 who had hydrocephalus, a condition where his body continued to produce cerebral spinal fluid, causing enough pressure that his brain did not develop properly. As a result, his head was about 42 inches in circumference. That was this child's lot in life, to have his head turned by me or one of my co-workers every 4 hours so that he did not suffer bed sores. He was nonverbal and did not have much more than a brainstem, but when I looked into that boy's eyes while I cared for him, there was a connection beyond mere curiosity. It was visceral, and to me it was a moment of divine gestalt. And it confirmed to me that although we might be limited in a variety of ways by the style of our chassis, we are all children of God. I shared that experience with Dad years after the fact, and his response, of course, "Il raison sur papa." It's interesting that though Dad's love for his children never changed, his parenting did take on a learning curve over the course of raising 10 or 11 of us, if you count Giselle and Jermaine and we Jennifer, our foster children. Because of Alex's growth as a parent, a skelpin seemed to have been phased out after Dave and I. Heather may have received a few smacks on the rear, but I'm sure the belt started and ended with Dave and I. Dad was a relatively calm scalper for the most part, however, sending us to our room so as to collect his thoughts, and often giving us time to stuff magazines, on one occasion hardcover books, down the seat of our pants. I remember that he snorted with laughter at our obvious ploy, and continued on anyway, books and all. He let us have that one. I recall once making a gate show of pleading for divine intervention in our punishment. It was certainly proved to be an exercise in futility. Well, God might have been amused. Dad certainly wasn't. So in the future, I learned to pray less like the Pharisee and more like the publican. Dad grew in his parenting from those early days. But since his love was a constant, Dave and I never made any decisions about ourselves that required changing later in life. A skelpin was practically a natural consequence for a Scots Presbyterian, and Dad claimed to have experienced many growing up. Alex's upbringing was an austere one. He came from a time and place of paucity and dearth. Dad was articulate and poetic, and his descriptive stories could paint such pictures for me, I felt I lived in them. When he spoke of his youth, the words he used to describe his immediate physical environment were consistently dour: the Stain row houses, Muck, Cal, Dreek, City, Fusti, Peelywally, and Wee. They formed a drab counterpart to his vivid descriptions of the people that populated that landscape. Here, Dad saved his glowing adjectives and colorful dialogue for the people in his life. That was his Scotland, the characters of West Calder and Polbeth that shaped his world view. He spoke of the gentleness of his father, the fortitude of his mother, and the humor in the nicknames of folks like Pie Jock, Auld Wooly, Wee Cocky, and Big Jimmy Tamson. And when Big Jimmy was asked to do more than his share because of his size, he would say, "My name's Tamson, no Samson." And the telling bark of the ragman offering big balloons for woolen rags. This was wartime, of course, and wool was highly sought after, whereas balloons were colorful but cheap and full of air. And that was Dad's slogan whenever he identified some deal that was more flash than substance. whether we were at a fair gawking at a gaudy display that had us fascinated, or an advertisement for some new device on TV. Dad was an expert on identifying a fleece job. Big, big balloons for woolen rags. It would be a rare thing for him to ever be on a losing end of a bargain, and yet a bargain he loved. In fact, even after we grew up and moved away, Dad still enjoyed a trip to Costco. I know Mom loved the time he came home with a shopping cart full, and maybe it was two, full of loaves of bread for the freezer. Only a day old, 99 cents a loaf. No balloons in that cart. Only wool for Alex. Dad's love for the country of his birth is evident in the stories of his youth and the many tours he led to that other holy land, Scotland. But his love for his adopted country was something else again. He embraced Canada not only for what it represented in opportunity and its rugged beauty, but also its history and geography. I thought nothing of it as a boy growing up, but Dad seemingly knew everything about Canada. One of the greatest boons of Dad's ministry, and for us as a family, is that he had 4 weeks holiday each year. He and Mom would pile the kids in the station wagon and either head east to Montreal or west to the Rocky. In the early days, it was giant canvas tents, which at least one of the kids would surreptitiously test with the palm of their hand during a rainy night. Look, the water comes through. Later, it became the tent trailer or the camper, but we camped. It was Coleman stoves and chopping wood by a campfire with bacon sizzling in a cast iron pan and a tin of beans with a makeshift wire handle bubbling on the fire. And always by water, whether it be a spring-fed burn running through King George Provincial Park outside Roslyn, BC, or the sandy-beached Pancake Bay, a family favorite along the north shore of Lake Superior. I have no idea where Dad got his knowledge of his adopted country, but he seemed to know it all. I took it for granted at the time, but in hindsight, I'm amazed at the depth of his love for Canada. He could tell us why the headwaters of the Bow River were turquoise, rock flour from gray seal melt suspended in the water reflecting sunlight, or why the Athabasca River near Jasper was murky. It was silt in one of the greatest changes in elevation that gave it its high turbidity from erosion, to the First Nations mythology behind Kakabeka Falls in Ontario. He told us the story of the Green Mantle, the Ojibwa princess, who pretended to be lost and wandered into the attacking Sioux camp. She bargains with them, spare her life and she will lead them to her father's camp. She's placed in the head of the lead canoe and leads herself and the Sioux warriors to their deaths over the Kakabeka Falls, sparing her tribe from attack. Or the story of the sleeping giant, the island you view traveling from the west when you reach Lake Superior. I simply accepted he was omniscient at the time. But in hindsight, it just showed his love for the country and not only his voraciousness for information, but his ability to retain and recall it. Dad was the unsung champion of IC, a traveling game where we amassed points based on the first to spot a predetermined list of items on our many trips. These could include bears, bighorn sheep, Rocky Mountain goats, moving trains, horses in a field, hawks, eagles, aircraft, even the orbit litter barrels in Manitoba, and the first grain elevator when we were returning to the prairies from the mountains of the Canadian Shield. I say Dad was the unsung champion because you could tell he spotted something first, and he was always first, and then gave it away with raised eyebrows and a discreet up, 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 to alert us and give us kids a chance to collect the points. Alex provided me with some great life lessons as I grew up, things that stuck with me and many that I've passed on to my boys. He taught me that when walking in a freshly made path after a new snowfall, not to simply step in the existing steps of the pathfinder before you, but to eclipse the boot prints with your own, to widen it slightly, to make it easier for those who follow. He taught me to do the same thing driving on Saskatchewan grid roads in the spring after a rain. Don't drive directly in the ruts someone else has made, but make them wider where you can so that others may find a road and not a pair of deeper ruts. He taught me simple fatherly things as well, to let the head of the axe do the work, to lift with your legs, and to accelerate a vehicle into a curve, never brake, to maintain control. And if you ever lost control, especially in winter, you're trying to come out of a spin, always look to where you want to go and not to where you don't, because you have a far greater chance of ending up where you are looking, regardless if that's your desired destination or not. Of course, this advice had a far greater application in life than for driving mishaps, to look where you wish to go and not where you would not like to be. When I look again at Dad's upbringing in Scotland, it's clear to see how he determined his worldview on social justice. That he was raised as a have-not is a matter of course. That in and of itself would not have affected young Alex's outlook, as Dad never had a covetous bone in his body, and he did not begrudge affluence. When he entered the workforce, particularly the coal mines, he saw firsthand how the landowner class treated human life as simply so much collateral when injury or death occurred during an accident which was all too frequent. A death in the mines affected the entire community, but appeared to have little value to the mine owners, and compensation to the survivors was trivial. In fact, it was the senseless death of a childhood friend, Jimmy McKinnon, that finally convinced Dad to answer the Ogilvy's department store advertisement in the Sunday Post looking for pipers and immigrate to Canada. He headed to Edinburgh to audition, where he and Geordie were selected from the applicants by the owner of Ogilvy's, who had made the trip to Scotland for that purpose. Now, growing up, I thought that Geordie and Alex were boyhood friends, but apparently that's where they met, at the pipe shop in Leith, where they were holding the auditions. So Geordie was actually from Troon on the west coast of Scotland. But that's where they met, and they had a lifelong friendship. They were the two selected from all of the applicants. Life was sacrosanct to Alex, and it instilled in him an intolerance for bullies and injustice. You could see this in his impassioned words about Palestine. He often vilified the senseless persecution of Jews throughout history, and at the same time, he was vocal about the state of Israel and the walls they imposed. In regard to oppression, he would quote Robbie Burns, "Man's inhumanity to man makes thousands mourn." Being very much a poet himself, Dad would often include his favorites in his sermons and later his blethers, which are a blessing in themselves. His writings are a treasure trove for all of us. So in transactional analysis, there are several schools of thought as to where the rebellious child belongs in the paradigm. There's a little bit of disagreement as to whether the rebellious child is merely a petulant aspect of the adapted child, a healthy aspect of the free child, or maybe a separate category into itself. I dare say Alex was in the free child school. Recalling Alex's formative years in Scotland and his intolerance for injustice, you don't have to imagine too greatly which category we, his children, have fallen into. I recall my sister in grade 3 having trouble with my sister Heather, having trouble with complaining that her teacher, when prodding her to do work or not answering a question to her standards, would tap her with the top of her head with the sharpened end of a pencil. So she talked to Dad about it, and his advice was, in all seriousness, stand up and kick her in the shins. What is she's 8 or 9? When I was in grade 9 in Moose Jaw, I was called to the office for some offense that now escapes me, naturally. And my punishment was to be the strap. So I wasn't having any of that, so when the vice principal got out this wide, thick hunk of leather and directed me to hold out my hand, I was brought up well, respectfully declined. Mr. Campbell said in that case he had no choice to phone my father. When I readily agreed, it seemed to take him aback for a moment, but he likely thought he was calling my bluff when he made the call and Dad answered his office at Minto. I only got to view the exchange from one side, of course, but I was confident how it would go. I watched this self-assured administrator begin his conversation smugly, telling Alex about his son's digression and his subsequent refusal to accept the strap, only to quickly express askance, followed by defensiveness, some stuttering, and finally resignation before hanging up the phone, meeting my gaze, and announcing I had detention for the foreseeable future. I can only imagine what Dad's reaction was. He never told me what Mr. Campbell said, or what he said to Mr. Campbell, and I didn't ask. I'm sure he wasn't happy with whatever happened, but the less said, the better. but it would reflect his determination to speak to authority and taking umbrage at the oppressor. Dad was a champion of the underdog. So Alex leaves many legacies behind. Most of you in this room will have experienced his ability to elicit positive change in your lives, to relight that spark. In my life, not only did he provide love and guidance, but I see his greatest legacy in all of this, and that's these people over here, his grandchildren. I particularly see it in my sons Ian and Cameron. Their intelligence, caring, and compassion are a refinement of Alex's gifts to his family. And it is clear that Dad gave me the tools to be a man long before his passing, judging by them alone. The Africans had it wrong. Some of you have commented that a light is gone from this world with Dad's passing, and how true that is. But as I have looked around this room, and when I see the number of people whom he touched with his love, wisdom, and counsel, I see enough relit lights to know Alex has done more than enough to continue to lend his light to the world now and for generations to come. So here you are for where you're going. Continue to light the world. My dad will smile as you do.